Hello, I'm Michael Blackwell, and I thought that for December we should talk about something seasonal. So I'm going to discuss pantomimes. Pantomimes have been going on in Norwich now for 300 years or so, and it's quite fascinating to look back at their history, to see how they've evolved over the years, but to see also how much of them has really stayed the same. So, don't look behind you, look straight ahead, and we'll find out what we can. Pantomimes were becoming increasingly popular throughout the country during the 1730s, most notably at the Covent Garden Theatre in London. All the earliest pantomimes had the same stock characters: Harlequin, Columbine, Pantaloon, and Clown. These were the characters from the Commedia dell'arte that arrived in England from continental Europe in the late 17th century. In every pantomime, the young lovers, Harlequin and Columbine, had to escape from two other stock characters, Pantaloon and Clown, who wanted to prevent their marriage. The plays were called pantomimes because, with the exception of a brief spoken opening, the fast-moving action and slapstick routines were all performed without words. Harlequin and Columbine were characters in every pantomime at the Theatre Royal in Norwich from its opening in 1758 through until 1880. Let's start by looking at the pantomimes in Norwich during the 18th century. First of all, let's imagine ourselves back in 1758 in the newly built Theatre Royal, watching the pantomime The Intrigues of Harlequin and Columbine. See if you can spot yourselves in the audience in this picture. Or this one. As the curtains opened, you'd have seen the cast on stage dressed in heavy costumes and big whole head masks obscuring their faces. This scene, known as the opening, was not easy to follow, as the big heads often muffled the words. But that was not terribly important, because you and the rest of the audience would have known the story already. A father who, wanting to marry off his nubile daughter to an unattractive man, and a daughter wanting to marry the handsome young man of her choice. The opening concludes with the father just about to have his way when a benevolent fairy appears and the transformation scene begins. When the fairy waves her wand, the characters are transformed. They cast off their heavy over costumes and their big heads to reveal colourful costumes beneath. Then followed a transformation of scenery, and Clown steps forward and says, "Here we are again." This was the signal for the beginning of the next and most important part of the show, the Harlequinade. You would then have seen several scenes performed entirely without dialogue. You'd have seen Harlequin and Columbine racing through numerous locations in their efforts to escape from Pantaloon and Clown. You'd have seen Harlequin repeatedly using his magic bat or his slap stick to create all kinds of comic obstacles to his pursuers. Yep, that's where the word originates. In the penultimate scene, as was the custom, you would have seen Pantaloon trapping the two young people in a dimly lit place. In this case, in 1758, Merlin's cave. Then, to your relief, you'd have seen the fairy reappear, making everything right. And usher in a final, bright and colourful scene during which Harlequin and Columbine were married and set out to live happily ever after. The Harlequinade, full of slapstick scenes involving pies, banana skins, stalking ghosts, and animals, was always played with great energy. Over the years, the stunts became more and more daring in an attempt to attract audiences. A playbill advertising the Norwich Theatre Royal Spring Pantomime of 1778, Neck or Nothing, or Harlequin's Flight from the Gods, announced that Harlequin will throw himself from the stage to the back of the gallery and from thence return head foremost over the pit to the back part of the stage, as performed at Edinburgh, Exeter and Plymouth with universal applause. In the 1782 production of the Election of Harlequin, the Election or Harlequin Triumphant, with the bakers in an uproar, Mr. Follett Jr.'s Harlequin impressed the audience by leaping into a hat box 6 feet high. In 1784, in Fortunatus, or Harlequin's Wishing Cap, Harlequin was back on form as he flew across the stage from balcony to balcony and, quote, escaped down his own throat, unquote. Unfortunately, no record was left of how he achieved this. Probably watching a silent movie of the Keystone Cops is probably the best way to get an idea of the style and tempo of the Harlequinade. What remains of the 18th century pantomime? Well, a great deal. In the 2019 theatrical performance of Cinderella, you would have seen a beautiful girl marrying a handsome young suitor, a lot of slapstick comedy, pantomime animals, and chase scenes, and with the encouragement of the audiences to interact with the characters, look behind you, etc., all of which comes from the 18th century pantomime. Now let's have a look at the 19th century and see how things changed. During the first decades of the 19th century, the structure of the pantomime changed considerably. During the early 1800s, influenced by the surge of patriotism during the Napoleonic Wars, themes became more anglicized, and English stories and nursery rhymes began to replace the serious classical myths of the opening. Mother Goose, or the Golden Egg, was performed in Norwich in 1808, and Harlequin Horror, Harlequin Horner, or the Christmas Pie 10 years later. The move to fairy tale themes is a change that will remain with us till today. When the Norwich-Reedham-Yarmouth railway line opened in 1844, it boosted audiences still further, as people from the outlying areas of the city could now consider a trip to the theatre. Pantomime was the natural vehicle to meet the needs of this expanding new market. And in the 1840s and 1850s, romantic pantomimes aimed at family audiences became regular and popular fixtures of the Theatre Royal programme. Adverts became really over the top. Harlequin and the Harlequinade were ever present, but increasingly the plot lines borrowed from nursery stories. The opening became longer and more important, and the big heads and cover-up costumes disappeared. The dialogue became more natural and comic and included more topical references and local satire. And there was more dancing, more elaborate scenery, and more gorgeous costumes. And as you can see from this, the over-the-top language of the adverts, the new, grand, comical, conundrumical, enigmatical, pseudo-iacal, thrasonical, demonological pantomime, written expressly for this theatre by an author whose whims, puns, peculiarities, mysteries, and socialities have set every audience in the three kingdoms in a roar, and so on. You can catch the flavour of the 19th century pantomime from the Theatre Royal poster of 1852. This playback bill maps Harlequin and Columbine's escape route. They are trapped in the mines of darkness in the mineral kingdom before their brilliant magical metamorphosis into the hive of 1,000 sweets in the palace of 1,000,000 pleasures. As the century progressed, the public grew tired of the wordless harlequinade, and indeed of Harlequin, who seemed more a continental than a true English character. Audiences showed a clear preference for a pun-strewn comic version of the nursery tale with a proper beginning, middle and end. In 1864, the Theatre Royal presented a pantomime called Snowdrop, King Bourbon and the Seven Elves, or The Magic Mirror and the Fatal Sewing Machine. But although the local press called it a capital hit and the Boxing Day audience was enchanted with it, it was the story of Snowdrop that won the rave reviews and not the harlequinade appendage. The Norfolk Chronicle loved the play, but felt that the harlequinade was too long and recommended curtailing it. The Norwich Mercury was even stronger, calling the harlequinade far too prolonged and the comic business very tame. Being in a pantomime was not without its risks. In 1871, Mr. Strange was playing Harlequin in the pantomime at the Theatre Royal, and in one scene was supposed to leap from the stage into the arms of a stagehand waiting in the wings. One night, the stagehand got drunk, or so they say, and failed to take up his position, and Mr. Strange ended up, not surprisingly, in the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital. Actually, there were many accidents at the Theatre Royal over the years, from fires, scenery collapsing, and so on. So what do we retain from this early 19th century period? Well, the nursery tale tradition was solidified, the masks and the cover-up costumes disappeared, the dialogue became more natural and comic, and there was more dancing, more elaborate scenery, and more gorgeous costumes. And significantly, the harlequinade disappeared. And the pantomimes continued, of course, to reflect patriotic themes. Let's turn now to the period from the later 19th century onwards. From the second half of the 19th century, the mainline theatres like the Theatre Royal came under increasing competition from the music halls and the burlesque theatres. In Norwich, the Connaught Varieties, that was the music hall on Lower Goat Lane, the Vaudeville Theatre in St Giles Street, that's on the site of the old Norwich skating rink, and the Adelphi Theatre, close to the site of the present-day city centre Sainsbury's, competed with the Theatre Royal, especially during the Christmas pantomime season. They competed with their slicker and often more risque productions. Unable to beat them, the Theatre Royal joined them. Like the larger theatres throughout the country, it incorporated into its pantomimes the most popular features from its competitors. Perhaps the most significant import was the cross-dressing popular in the burlesque theatres. In pantomimes, the female impersonators became the grotesque male dames, of which Dan Leno was the most famous. The cross-dressing woman in burlesque, such as Hetty King, were transformed into the dashing female principal boy, like Vesta Tilley. These young women, with their long, shapely legs and body-hugging costumes, were particularly effective in attracting male customers who, at that time, had no opportunity of seeing attractive girls in such revealing attire. The influence of burlesque theatre on the Theatre Royal pantomime was evident in the 1869 edition. The King of the Peacocks, the correspondent of the Norwich Mercury, was obviously most uneasy with it. He liked the scenery and the costumes, but he disliked the cross-dressing, calling for one of the Dane parts to be given to a woman. He also disliked the style of dialogue, finding that the puns were too far-fetched even for burlesque. The influence of the music hall became apparent a few years later. In 1877, the Theatre Royal advertised the first appearance of the well-known comedian Will Rogerson and a skipping rope dance by Miss Fletcher in the pantomime Beauty and the Beast, or Harlequin, Princess Or, and the Good Fairy of the Wedding Ring. The appearance of celebrities in pantomimes became very common as the century wore on. After 1880, the new finally replaced the old. Harlequin and the other traditional characters disappeared, as did the long harlequinade without words. From then on, all the plots were all fairy story based. It was during this third stage of development that most of the final essential elements of our contemporary pantomime were added. So let's take a look at the recent pantomimes at the Theatre Royal and see if we can spot the historical influences. From the 18th century, we see slapstick comedy, pantomime animals, chase scenes, audience interaction, transformation scenes and exotic costumes and scenery, and of course, a young man and woman overcoming everything, all obstacles to marry and live happily ever after. All of these features remain unchanged from the 18th century. From the 19th century, we still have a traditional nursery story played by a large cast and beautiful costumes and scenery, dance numbers which feature local talent, awful puns and dreadful jokes, and from the late 19th century, we have the cross-dressing. So, as far as pantomime in Norwich goes, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Well, I hope you found that interesting, and if you did enjoy it, please tell your friends that they can find it and other historical talks on the Norwich Society YouTube channel. If you didn't enjoy it, tell your friends we're on the Ipswich Society channel. Thank you.